Introduction. After trying to climb Mount Ararat in eastern Turkey, which is a whole other story, I crossed the border into nearby Iran, or Persia, a fabled land that I'd long wanted to visit, whatever its current unpopularity in the West. I ended up spending 3 weeks in Iran, in the September and October of 2018, and I've got lots of amazing photos to share with you, along with videos that appear in some blog posts I've put up about Iran, as well. But first, why go there in the first place? I'll run through some of the things that are distinctive about Iran, setting the scene for my own accounts of travel a bit further on. I read a blog about how to travel from Turkey to Tehran overland, and it inspired me to give it a go. This is the route I followed, starting from the Turkish border region town of Doğubeyazıt, close to Mount Ararat, and then on to the capital of Tehran and down south through the middle of the country. I'll be describing my itinerary in more detail in Chapter 2, below. While I was in Iran, I would also see smugglers, prostitutes working under the cover of a custom called temporary marriage, sanctioned by clerics, and be offered beer and all the drugs under the sun. I also learned about how the culture of the nation is not merely the official one, but also one that has been shaped by its love of art and by the satirical quality of its most famous poets, who used their wit against arbitrary authority, religion carried to tiresome excess, and anyone who uses, abuses or bullies others. I also discovered that in ethnic minority regions in the north, the writ of the government hardly ran and that many people did what they liked. It wasn't like what you read in the Western media about Iran as this buttoned-down sort of a place, almost the opposite. Chapter 1. Iran Travel Tips. The main airport for international air arrivals is Tehran. But because of international sanctions and embargoes, there are only a limited range of airlines flying in and out of Tehran. English-speaking and East Asian countries do not serve Iran. The only large Western airlines that fly to Tehran at the moment are Lufthansa and Alitalia. Russian, Ukrainian, Turkish, Indian and Middle Eastern airliners are more likely to be seen in Tehran, including those of major international carriers like Emirates, Qatar Airways, and Air India. If you travel to Iran and get an Iranian stamp on your passport, you may not be allowed to enter the United States. For that reason, the Iranians will often give you a visa stamped on a separate piece of paper. TripAdvisor works well in Iran for accommodation and things to do. There are many hostels that cater for international tourists on a budget. Western banking sanctions mean that you cannot use an ordinary credit card anywhere in Iran. Instead, it's necessary to get a local debit card called a MAR card, and to put money on that, refundable when you leave the country, if there is a positive balance. This can be organized online before you get to Iran, with a topped-up MAR card delivered to your accommodation when you get there. I was able to use ExpressVPN for $10 a month, which is necessary if you want to post on Facebook while in Iran. You can also use WhatsApp in Iran without any problems. I was going to enter Iran on my British passport because I use my New Zealand passport most of the time. I always travel with my New Zealand passport, and I was going to several of the countries that are offside with Iran on my New Zealand passport. I thought it would be prudent to use my British passport for Iran, and the New Zealand passport for the other countries. It turned out that I'd got things the wrong way around. New Zealand has no particular quarrel with Iran. But Britain is one of the countries that are always offside. The Brits have just arrested an Iranian freighter at Gibraltar, after all. And if there were to be a war between Iran and the Americans, the British would probably join in on the American side. It turns out that at the time, if I went as a British tourist, I would have had to take a formal guided tour in a group of at least 2, plus guide. There's a useful and up-to-date blog on these sorts of travel details, here. It's called Borders of Adventure. But before all that fully dawned on me, I paid some money up front to a travel agent in London. This was a waste because it locked me, as a solo traveler, into a busload of Brits package tour thing, which I became less and less keen on the more I researched it online. I looked at all the guided tours for British people and found that I would have had to shell out a lot of money to get to all the places I wanted to go to. Plus, not having the freedom to wander off and do my own thing. And it was hard to even get a visa on a British passport. I'd applied in January, and after ringing this guy in London about 40 times by the time July rolled round, I still didn't have a visa yet. I was getting really anxious because by July I was in the Middle East already and facing the prospect of using up my travel time and having to go home without ever having got a visa for Iran. I felt that my Middle East trip would be incomplete if I couldn't get into Iran. That magical, mysterious, and, as it now seemed, quite inaccessible land of mystery. Eventually he said to me, "Look, just use your Kiwi passport and it won't be a problem." Hallelujah. I wish I'd known that 6 months before. And so, I applied for a visa on my New Zealand passport in Istanbul. This took only 3 or 4 days to go through. The Iranians interviewed me and didn't seem put out by the fact that my New Zealand passport was full of American and Israeli stamps. In fact, I could have got a visa from the Iranian embassy in Wellington before I left. The Iranians give you a stamp on a piece of paper that you can use to get into Iran. Because it's on a separate piece of paper, you don't have to show the Americans or anyone else who might bar you from entering their country because you've been to Iran. It's worth keeping abreast of all these blacklists, especially in the age of President Trump, who some time back tweeted, a whole list of allegedly terrorist-filled countries that you wouldn't be able to get into the USA from anymore. The list included Iran, and Lebanon too. So, the British visa thing was a 6-month nightmare that I could have completely avoided. On the other hand, you could physically do Iran by yourself. I met women who were traveling alone in Iran. It's a very safe place. If a woman is attacked or raped, the perpetrator runs the risk of being hanged, especially if the woman is a foreign visitor. So, I suppose, thinking that you could be hanged would put a lot of people off raping foreign women. That's sort of the rule. I stayed in hostels run by a group called CU in Iran. These offer a choice of own rooms or dorm rooms and have several hostels in various cities. Iran has quite an extensive network of railways, which runs to all the major cities and carries many passenger services. There are also very comfortable intercity coach services. Fares are quite cheap by Western standards. There will soon be a high-speed rail line from Tehran to Isfahan, via Qom. This will surely be a bit more expensive than the regular services. Chapter 2. Where I went. I first visited the northwestern city of Tabriz, where I got properly organized for the trip. And then I went on to the Alamut Valley, once home to a guild of medieval assassins, rebels fighting for the poor and downtrodden more or less, whose targets were the local equivalents of the Sheriff of Nottingham at the time. Their leader, Hassani Sabah, dwelt on a spectacular crag. His castle is now being restored. From Alamut, I went on to Tehran, the capital of Iran, with its many attractions such as the fabulous Golestan Palace. The word Golestan means rose garden, and it's one that you keep coming across in Iran. From Tehran, I took a side trip to the Caspian Sea resort of Shiraz. The land of Iran is sandwiched between the Persian Gulf to the south and the Caspian Sea to the north. In spite of its name, the Caspian Sea is actually a lake. It's the world's biggest lake, in fact, 1.5 times as big as all of North America's Great Lakes put together. Because it's so big, and also because it's slightly salty, it's not called a lake but rather, the Caspian Sea. The Caspian Sea's Iranian shore lies just north of a belt of mountains and green forests, which the mountains help to sustain by catching moisture from the Caspian Sea as mist and rain. About 6 million people live between the sea and the woodlands on a sort of riviera, which stretches for 400 kilometers along the shore and can be seen from space, as somewhere that's lit up at night. The Caspian Riviera is where people from Tehran go on holiday. The Great Forest, which adds to the area's attractions, was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site on 5 July, 2019, the latest in what's already a long list of World Heritage Sites in Iran. You can see the mountains, which are called the Alborz, in this photo of myself on a new pedestrian bridge in Tehran. From the city, it's possible to climb to a lookout in the Alborz, visit a hillside summer palace complex called Saadabad, and even take a gondola up to ski fields. It's because of the Alborz, and their forests, that Robin Hood types like Hassani Sabah were able to flourish in this area. Although it's where the capital is now, northern Iran has always had a bit of a wild frontier reputation. The early civilization of Persia was actually based in the south, and the capital was only shifted to Tehran as recently as 1796. Which is very recent, by the standards of a country so ancient that in 1971 it celebrated the 2500th anniversary of its foundation. After Tehran, I went south to the delightful, planned city of Isfahan, perhaps the first garden city. It has a famous boulevard, famous gardens, famous bridges, a famous town square and some of the most amazing mosques and palaces in all of Iran as well. Everywhere south of the Caspian Sea and its belt of woodlands is quite dry. Isfahan depends on a river called the Zyang to keep it fresh and green. Unfortunately, the Zyang had dried up completely when I was there. 21st century Iran has huge water problems. This is partly because of global warming, and partly because of a combination of population growth and international sanctions that limit food imports, so that more water has to be taken to grow food in the desert. A big lake west of Tabriz, Lake Urmia, which used to be 140 kilometers from end to end, has dried up quite dramatically since the early 1980s. 100 years ago, Iran's population was only about 10 million. At the time of the Islamic Revolution in 1979, it was about 40 million. Today, it is more than 80 million. In a mostly desert country, such population growth can't help but put pressure on things. From Isfahan and its dried-up river, apparently now flowing again, but perhaps not for long, I went on to Shiraz, after which a famous wine is named, even though the present Islamic Republic of Iran is dry. It turns out that they were a bit more tolerant in the old days. Shiraz is the home of the famous medieval poets Sa'di and Hafez, and I visited their tombs. Poets like these are to the Persian language what Shakespeare is to English. While in Shiraz, I visited the ancient monument sites of Naqsh-i-Rostam, where emperors such as Xerxes are buried inside a cliff. You might remember Xerxes as the evil, camped-up villain in the film 300, all dripping with rings and gold chains. Well, he wasn't really like that. And I went on to Persepolis, the ancient capital of Persia, which was burned by the Greek conqueror Alexander the Great, or not so great if you are a Persian. And then to Pasargadae, where the tomb of Cyrus the Great, the founder of Persia, still stands. Here's the Faravaha, ancient symbol of Iran's indigenous Zoroastrian religion, at Persepolis. A modern sign at a Zoroastrian center, in Yazd, explains the significance of the Faravaha, also spelt Faravaha, said to be the origin of the wedding ring. From Shiraz and its nearby ancient sites, I went finally to the incredible desert city of Yazd, where wind-catching towers pull cool, moist air out of caverns to air-condition the people's homes, all without electricity. And to its satellite town of Yazd, also famous for its old quarter. The area around Yazd is also a stronghold of the Zoroastrian religion, now largely displaced by Islam elsewhere in Iran. I visited a Zoroastrian shrine and school and the famous Towers of Silence where the deceased used to be laid out for vultures to eat, the funeral custom of the Zoroastrians at the time they were built. Along the way, I took lots of photos and videos of fabulous, sumptuous beauty, mosques, palaces, tapestries, bazaars, and modern art. 4. It turns out that Iran is one of the most artistic countries in the world. Chapter 3. Getting across the border. It's about 20 or 30 kilometers from the mountain town of Doğu-Beyazıt, where I was based for my Mount Ararat adventures, to the border. Like most people in this part of Turkey, my mountain guide, who'd helped me on Ararat, was Kurdish. The nearest bit of Iran was mostly inhabited by Kurds too. I thought it might help if my guide in Turkey could hook me up with a driver from among his relations on the other side. This person could take me through to Tabriz, my first stop in Iran, and maybe further on if necessary. Since I'd never been to Iran and had no idea what to expect, I thought that hiring a trustworthy driver would be a really good idea, especially if they could also serve as a local guide. It would cost a lot more than catching buses. But I figured it would be money well spent if it helped save me from getting lost in a bad part of town. My Turkish/Kurdish guide said he did know a few kinsfolk on the other side. So that's what we decided to do. A friend gave us both a ride to the Turkish customs. I was to change money there and meet my driver on the other side. I'd heard that I would have to dress appropriately, it being Iran and all that. So, I was wearing a green kaftan that I'd bought from Coptic Christians in Egypt, and a black and white West Bank Palestinian keffiyeh, the kind Yasser Arafat wore, for a headscarf. This mix of styles probably made me look very international. The West Bank is the sort of place where the temperature varies between burning hot and biting cold. My keffiyeh was made of wool, for the cold. But this was September and my head was boiling. I seriously thought about taking it off as soon as the coast was clear, whether I was in Iran or not. Eventually I made it to the head of the line and spoke to a woman dressed very somberly in a black chador, the Persian word for strict Islamic female attire, and also for tent, and she said it was very safe for women to go to Iran without a guide and that I should have just caught the bus after all. It was very safe, as things turned out. At this point I haven't yet set foot in Iran, beyond the point of talking to a black-clad female border guard. So, I should recap on the trouble I had in trying to get to Iran, actually. Anyhow, my Turkish/Kurdish guide and I went through customs, and the Turkish official asked if I was a diplomat. And I thought that's really interesting. Perhaps the international nature of my kaftan and keffiyeh wasn't just a wardrobe muddle. Maybe it really did make me look like some kind of seasoned international traveler. There wasn't an issue going through the Turkish customs, and then on the Iranian side there wasn't an issue either. Because I was being handed from a Turkish guide to an Iranian driver, nobody was worried about what I was doing there by myself, as they might have been otherwise, and I also had sufficient funds to change. Now, the Iranian money, that was another story. The official unit of currency is called the rial. Individually, the rial is almost worthless. I changed $1,000 into 40 million rials, which gives you an idea of how much one rial is worth. Or not. Perhaps for that reason, Iranians like to reckon the price in tomans, an old currency unit that was worth 10 rials when last officially issued in 1965. The toman's not been an official currency unit for years, and officially the signs are all supposed to give the price in rials. Yet the shopkeeper may still quote you the price, verbally, in tomans. It's not 90% off, just tomans. It's good to have both American and local money, really, and you need to keep an eye on your currency. Later on, when I went to Tehran, I discovered the mark card that you could put money on. When you left Iran, they would refund your money, and the administration fees were not high at all. Chapter 4. Tabriz and the Road of the Martyrs, Mistresses and Hash. At the border, I had no real plan apart from to go to Tabriz. Perhaps I would be driven further. Petrol, or gasoline, is very cheap in Iran, so much so that I heard that it was smuggled over the border in spite of all the difficulties and dangers of being a gas smuggler. The cheapness of fuel kept the costs of being driven around Iran down to a reasonable level, though it was still costlier than the bus. At least once you'd paid for the car and the driver, filling up the tank wouldn't blow an additional hole in your wallet the way it does in New Zealand. The first thing we did, very shortly after hitting the road, was to pick up the driver's brother in a border town. He was to be my guide. There, I was confronted with a cigarette smuggling ring. I saw men stuffing cigarettes down their trousers. They do this at great risk. So much for respectability. I was a bit nervous at being in possession of $1,000 in cash in what seemed like bandit country. But they were honorable bandits, and so we carried on, the driver, the driver's brother, and me. In Tabriz I spent my first night with the driver's wife, mother-in-law and mother. And the very first thing his wife said to me was, "If you don't wear a hijab, or headscarf, in Iran you'll be killed." She didn't speak much English but she just sort of got her finger and put it across her neck and said, "You'll be killed." I thought. My driver also told me the Revolutionary Guard used to make him remove the rings from his fingers and cut his hair, and said he hated it. He added that they had stopped picking on him lately. Kurdish money changes at the airport outside Tabriz turned my $1,000 into 40 million rials. That was a whole sack of money. The driver's brother helped with the transaction. You can't use foreign cards in Iranian ATMs, but you can organize a mark card from overseas. And you can put the money in overseas as well. Since I only found out about mark cards once I got to Tehran, we were still doing everything the old-fashioned way. I always get a local SIM card when I travel, and I was lucky enough to get one from a store in 5 minutes, beating the queues, by using my Kurdish guide's name instead of mine. Everywhere, you saw an official, composite image of the late Imam Khomeini seated cozily in front of his successor as supreme or holy leader, Ali Khamenei, no relation, as Khomeini looks now. Before the 1979 revolution, Khomeini was known as the Ayatollah Khomeini. Imam is the most senior and honorary religious title in the Shia tradition, an honorific bestowed after the revolution when Khomeini became Iran's first supreme leader. In the West we still think of him as the Ayatollah, the title he held when he was getting the most Western press. Khomeini died in 1989 and was succeeded by Khamenei, who obviously didn't have a white beard back then. So, that was interesting. And the driving in Iran, yeah, well, The bus service that I was to use was safe and reliable. But private motorists drove fast. Really fast. In Tabriz, we went sightseeing, my first chance to see Iran. I stayed with an Azeri, the ethnic group most common in neighboring Azerbaijan. His wife discussed the prostitution that was being practiced in Iran by way of temporary marriages, which she objected to. It was the first I'd heard of that. Later on, I was to meet a woman who explained to me that the custom of temporary marriage also enabled people who didn't actually want to get married right now to have relationships, since premarital sex was technically illegal. She was living with her boyfriend, but they hadn't bothered to get a temporary marriage. She came from a wealthy background and was headstrong. She said the authorities would have to catch her in the act to prove anything. Tabriz is the capital of an Iranian province called East Azerbaijan. Azeris are a majority here, too. The Azeris are not related to the Persians but rather to the Turks. On the other hand, the Kurds, who straddle the Turkish border, aren't related to the Turks but rather to the Persians. Contested for centuries between old-time Turkish and Persian empires, this region is very mixed and remains so for hundreds of kilometers on either side of the official frontier. The Kurds don't have an independent country of their own. The reason the Azeris do is because there used to be a region of the former Soviet Union known as Soviet Azerbaijan, on the other side of the Soviet/Iranian border from the Azeri districts of Iran. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the former Soviet Azerbaijan found itself an independent republic. Such are the accidents of history. If there had been a Soviet Kurdistan, it would probably have become independent too. But there wasn't. Tabriz is full of heritage, and I'm annoyed I didn't spend more time there and take more photos. I've got a lot more for the other cities. By the way, you can look up the monuments of every city on Wikimedia templates, as well as the usual guides. It's a really good idea. And there's new stuff as well. We saw an interesting monument and park that had apparently only just been created in an eastern part of Tabriz. The white monument we saw didn't come up on the Wikipedia template of Tabriz monuments, which also makes me think it is new. Iran has had a massive program of building new houses and parks going for some years. The Iranian government takes the cities very seriously. Partly, this is because Iran has had such a massive population explosion over the last few decades, with just about all of the new population appearing in the cities. Anyhow, here's a photo of me beside another monument, a statue of the poet Tarkani, who lived in Tabriz in the same general era as Hafez and Saadi in Shiraz. In those days Iranians were few, and the cities were small. And yet they managed to produce one of the world's most amazing cultures, and even a large empire which, though it was frequently conquered by outsiders because Iranians were so few, always bounced back. For the next night I stayed with another local family so as not to impose on my driver's relatives. Airbnb doesn't operate in Iran. Hawkers on the street offered accommodation, though you took your chances there. And there was also social media, Snapchat and WhatsApp. The Iranian government keeps trying to censor the local internet, and because of that you can't easily use Facebook directly, though I was able to use ExpressVPN for $10 a month. TripAdvisor is widely used in Iran, there's no ban on that. Word of mouth also seems to convey a lot of information. That was how I got my second place. The man of this new house was a business owner recommended by my driver and his brother, the ones who had been recommended to me by my Kurdish guide in Turkey. I slept on the floor in the children's room, and the businessman's wife was lovely. You should have seen what they grew. They had a veritable oasis, with plenty of fruit and olives. The next morning, I was offered some hash by the businessman and I thought, once again, this is really interesting, to be offered hash in Iran. And it wasn't the only drug I was offered either. I read a blog that said prostitution was quite common as well. So, what you get in the international media in terms of Iran being straight-laced, and what you get in terms of actually visiting the country, are two different things. I guess it was like America during Prohibition. Literally so, for later on I ran into people who seemed to have no problem getting hold of booze, which is officially banned from open sale in the Islamic Republic of Iran as well, of course. So, I wasn't particularly impressed, and I said to both my guide and my driver that I wanted to go to somewhere a bit more authentic and less westernized. I said that I wanted to go to Alamut, a famous scenic valley with a ruined castle overlooking it, several hundred kilometers further on down the road. Our growing band of travelers now included the businessman and a further addition. His mistress. We all went in down the road in the direction of the Alamut Valley in the one car. That pissed me off a bit, considering I had just met the businessman's charming wife, and yet now I had to be nice to his mistress, of whom he was very protective. Bloody hypocrisy. Plus, things were getting a bit crowded by this stage. Our original plan had been to hit the main road leading southeast to Tehran and then turn left after a short while to Gilan province and Rud Khan Castle, near the border with Azerbaijan, and from there to head for Alamut along the beautiful shores of the Caspian Sea. But the roads were too bad up there apparently, and it was going to take about 2 days to get to Alamut Castle that way. So, instead of the scenic route, we just kept on down the main road. Even on the main road, it was a really long drive. We left at about 10 o'clock and were still driving at 5 o'clock. Still, the drive to Alamut was fantastically interesting. They had photos of heroes lining the road the entire way. Iran was severely affected by the war with Iraq from 1980 to 1988. Nobody really knows how many people were killed in the war, but the government of Iran admits to losing 184,000 troops on its side. The war was triggered by Saddam Hussein making a grab for Iran's oil fields, which are in the predominantly Arab part in the southwest, close to Basra and also close to Kuwait. The war ended in utter stalemate and a UN-brokered peace deal that enforced a return to the way things were before. So, it was all for nothing in the end, except insofar as Saddam had been prevented from winning by the Iranians, who got no credit for it from the West. At the time, Iraq was egged on by the same Western powers who would later turn on Saddam. In the 1980s, Western governments disliked the Ayatollah Khomeini even more than they disliked Saddam Hussein. Of some relevance here was the fact that the Ayatollah's regime had lately taken the occupants of the American embassy hostage, in the hope of achieving the extradition of the recently deposed Shah. I'll have a bit more to say about all that further on. Continuing along the road toward Qazvin, where we would soon turn off toward Alamut, we noticed that there was a bit of forest along the way. It wasn't the scenic route, but it was a really interesting journey. Or maybe it was just that I was new to the country. Chapter 5. The Valley of the Assassins and the Freedom of the North, being offered all drugs under the sun and women with no hijabs. The history of Alamut is fascinating. You may have heard the fabled tale of Old Man of the Mountain, which goes like this. Once upon a time, there was an old man who lived in a castle in Persia. There, he created a guild of ninja-like assassins, to be sent out into the world to kill corrupt tax collectors and other oppressors of the people. The assassins were fearless and struck in broad daylight in front of vast crowds for maximum effect, heedless of their own safety. In the more fanciful versions of the tale, the old man got his assassins hopelessly befuddled on drugs, hashish, in particular, and led them into a beautiful garden, telling them that this was paradise and that it was the place to which they would return if they were slain by their target's bodyguards. The story of the Old Man of the Mountain inspires the modern computer game, Assassin's Creed. Amazingly, it's true, though probably not the vision of paradise bit, which seems to have been added later on by Marco Polo and other travelers who heard about the whole business third or fourth hand. The Old Man of the Mountain was an Ismaili religious leader and warrior named Hassani Sabah. The Ismaili are a sect of Shia Islam not seen as heretical, unlike the Baha'i. Hassani Sabah, who lived from around 1050 to 1124 CE, or AD, directed most of his energies not only against particular officials but also against the country's recent conquerors. Strategists commenting on the present Gulf crisis often say that Iran is unconquerable. With its mountains and vast distances, the country is several times bigger than France. Well, whether that's true or not today, Iran has certainly been conquered many times in the past. Perhaps that's because, until recently, this vast and cultured country held only a surprisingly small population. In Hassani Sabah's time, Iran was ruled from Baghdad, at that time a Turkish rather than an Arab capital. Baghdad's a long way away from northern Iran, and so Hassani Sabah decided to fight not only particular injustices, but also to fight the Turks in a wider sense. He was thus not only a sort of Robin Hood but also a sort of William Wallace, the Scottish independence fighter celebrated in the film Braveheart. Of course, to the Turks, Hassani Sabah and his followers were terrorists. And perhaps his methods were misguided. For, while it has been conquered many times, Iran has always risen again, for reasons that have less to do with its warlike capacities than with the soft power of its culture, which over the centuries has successfully converted Mongols, Turks and Arabs to the Persian way of doing things. Hold that thought, for I'm going to come back to it later. Anyhow, where does the word assassin come from, and what does it mean? Many people say that it must have something to do with all that hashish. Well, no. Hassani Sabah called his warriors Asashun, meaning people who are faithful to the foundation of the Muslim faith, that is, which includes a certain sympathy for the underdog. But Marco Polo misheard this expression and thought it meant people doped up on hashish. And that seems to be where the story of the fake paradise crept in. Alamut Castle was Hassani Sabah's stronghold. It sits on top of an amazing crag at more than 2,000 meters elevation in the Alamut Valley, an important scenic area in its own right. Alamut means the eagle's nest. Quite randomly, I found a place to stay on a winding side road leading up to the Alamut Valley and ultimately to the Caspian Sea. We just looked around. We hadn't pre-booked anything. I found this place, which had obviously shone in earlier days. It was a bit run down now. But the woman managing it was glad to see us, and she would make us local food. I had my own room, and the guys shared a room, and the man and mistress left. There were a whole lot of Iranians there, and the women weren't wearing any hijabs, that is, headscarves. They were young Iranian women who said that they didn't want to wear the bloody hijab, and certainly didn't want to get married. And I met an Iranian guide who asked me what sort of drugs I wanted. That was weird, and I said I didn't want any. What I found out later was that in this highland area, Hassani Sabah's old stomping ground, there's an unofficial agreement with the leadership that people who go up into the hills can do what they want. The women there just wore very, very skinny headbands around their heads. They actually don't wear hijabs. They wear tight-fitting clothes, dresses and skirts. And they certainly don't wear the chador, tent. And so, I was actually rather shocked to say the least. You get a certain impression of Iran through the media, and it's just not that way at all. Or not everywhere at any rate. We went up and we had a look at the castle, and it was absolutely beautiful. It wasn't a major climb, and I met an archaeologist and a teacher. At the time I was very fascinated with the Ismaili sect. I had just been to Egypt and had made a visit to an Ismaili shrine created by the Aga Khan, the leader of the sect. The castle was being reconstructed by Iran's Cultural Heritage Organization, and a mosque was being built as well. We wondered about the site, but couldn't really go in. We had to hike up a hill to get to the castle, the mountain in other words, and at the top there was a person selling tea. I asked for coffee at first. There were 40 varieties of tea on sale, some of them quite amazing. I got to chatting with some of the locals who lived in the area, and they started singing Kurdish songs. I heard so many Kurdish songs. Many of the Kurdish songs were songs of warriors.